Morning. Today's shir is sponsored Le'ilu Nishmas Tzvi Yehuda ben Eliezer and as a schus for Refuah Shlema for Bashava Rachel Basinda Gittel. We're in the middle of discussing last week we started talking about the Zohar, when the Zohar came on the scene, how the Zohar changed things, etc. And we left off that we're going to get specifically into the details of the integration of Zohar into Halacha, or Kabbalah into Halacha. Now, really, that could take us a year to discuss. There's dozens, probably hundreds already of occurrences where Kabbalah has morphed into Halacha or integrated itself into Halacha. In particular, like in Inyanei Tefillah and Inyanei Anhaga. Less so like in Issa V'Heter or Even Ezer, Yeridei, Cheshem Mishpat, but more in Tefillah and such. In particular, there are several individuals whose approach to Halacha and Kabbalah itself is worthy of a share. L'mashal, starting, let's say, from the Chida, the Ben Ish Chai, Bavadia, the Goin, the Mishnah Bruras, etc., etc. There's many different people whose just their position itself on the integration of Halacha and Kabbalah is worthy of a share. So what I'm going to try to do is just give a little bit of like the building blocks of this discussion. And obviously we're not going to be able to get to even close to everything today. I want to start as follows. In 1950, the Rabbanut in Eretz Yisrael published a list of takanas. They made takanas for the whole Rabbanut. It was signed by Rav Herzog and Rav Uziel. These were the two chief rabbis at the time. And they made a few rules. They wanted to standardize certain halachic practices for all of Eretz Yisrael. One of the things that they standardized is as follows. They said that if the Hechatimta should present itself where there's a situation that needs either Yibum or Chalitza, right? Meaning, i.e., someone dies without children, they have brothers. So the Torah gives two remedies for that. There's either Yibum or Chalitza. Should such a situation present itself where there's a need for the Yibum or Chalitza, the Rabbanut's overseeing body, led by the two chief rabbis, established that the rule should be only Chalitza, no Yibum. And I would say that they were reasonably successful. I doubt anybody in the room has ever heard of anyone having Yibum or seen a Yibum. Some of us have probably seen a Chalitza or heard of a Chalitza. It exists. It's Baruch Hashem not the most common thing in the world, but it's a thing. You have not heard of anybody having Yibum. And that is partially because the Rabbanut in 1950, so to speak, outlawed Yibum. They banned Yibum. They said only Chalitza from here on in. Now, one of the most famous misnagdim to this rule that the Rabbanut made was a young man, an uber talented Talmud Chacham, someone whose star would yet shine over the Rabbanut. Everybody knows him. His name is Rav Yosef. But he was 30 years old when this happened in 1950. I have to do the math exactly, but he was around 30. He published later, the tshuva wasn't published right away, he published it later, in Chelik Vav of Yabi Omer, a masterpiece of a tshuva, probably 10-12 pages of just reams and reams of Paiskim and raid and back and forth, and why Chalitza is not the only way to go, and why Yibum could still exist, and why the Sephardi Minig, even more than that, the Sephardi Meseira was to have Yibum, and he felt that this was like a major capitulation for the Rabbanut to capitulate to the Ashkenazi custom. Meaning, he said Rav Uziel, for lack of a better word, didn't have a spine. He didn't have a backbone. And when Rav Herzog pushed him to capitulate to this policy that it should be only Chalitza, he bent to the Ashkenazi custom, and he ignored the old Sephardi heritage. And this was all the kernels of Rav Avadia's future battles and innovations, or Lahach Zar Torah L'Yoshin, or whatever Rav Avadia did for Sephardim and for the Rabbanut and Bechlal and Eretz Yisrael. Really, you could already sense coming to light in this tshuva. It's an amazing tshuva. I started noticing this as we're going through some interesting tshuvas over the years, paying attention to how old the Mechabrim were when they wrote them, and seeing that often these tshuvas that we're discussing that are worthy of a whole maracha are written when these Mechabrim were in their 20s and 30s. So this is another one of those. And Rav Avadia pushed back; he didn't allow it. And Rav Avadia, it was written for a case that was actually happening for someone who came from Georgia or Kazakhstan or something, and he allowed a Yibum to go forth in 1950. Now in 1972, which is in Chelik Ches of Yabi Omer, Rav Avadia is written to the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, who was an Ashkenazi, who was approached by a Yemeni couple. So it's an Ashkenazi Rav, a Yemeni couple reaching out to Iraqi Paisik and saying, what do we do over here? And Rav Avadia doubles down and says again, you know what I feel, and you have what to be semach on, and you could allow them to do a Yibum if they want to. This is what Rav Avadia says. This was Rav Avadia's position. But Lamaisa, he was fighting a losing battle, because Yibum today is kamat gone. Not kamat, it's gone. You don't hear of anybody doing Yibum, and it became only Chalitza. So what is the Shaila of Yibum and Chalitza? And what does this have to do with our discussion of Kabbalah and Halacha? So to understand that, we have to go back let's wind back like 500 years before Shulchan Aruch, even before the time of the Shulchan Aruch, to a fight that happened in Crete. There was the island of Crete. It's in the Sfarim, in the Paiskim, it's referred to as Canadia. The city is Canadia, with it's Canada with a K. Is what Canadia is. Is basically how it's spelled. It was a city that had a large Jewish population. It switched between being Italian or Greek or Romani. It had many different tkufis, what the minhagim of the Kila was. But it seems at this point in 1460, which is like 500 years really before this Ravadia Machlekes with the Rabbanot, there was a shayla on the island of a Yibum Chalitza situation that arose. And it seems there was two Rabbanim on the island at the time. One of them was a native-born Cretan. He was from Crete. His name was Reb Michal Hakayin Balbo. I don't know what that name is, but he was Michal Hakayin Balbo. I don't know anything else about him except that he was involved in this fight. And he, like the prevailing Sephardic custom was machriya that this couple could do Yibum. Should they want to, they could do Yibum. There was a young, again, a man in his 30s, a young Ashkenazi, probably, maybe from Eretz Yisrael, maybe from Ashkenaz itself, Rav by the name of Reb Moshe ben Shmuel Hakayin Ashkenazi. Generally, in those days when someone's referred to, there was no last name, so if somebody's referred to as Ashkenazi, it generally means he was like a transplant, like someone who didn't belong there, who came from Ashkenaz. So either he was a first generation Ashkenazi or a second generation Ashkenazi, but he was an Ashkenazi of some variety or another. And he was there, and he put up a big fuss about this Yibum. He says, no, the minig, the custom in Ashkenaz, based on a psak of Rashi and Ibn Tam and others, is that we only do chalitza. And we'll go into a little bit what this machlekes is, b'yisaydei, as we only do chalitza. And therefore, how could you allow this person to do Yibum? It has to be chalitza. This was the thing. And no less than 6 contrasim were published back and forth between Reb Michal Balbo and Reb Moshe Ashkenazi, back and forth with each other, arguing about it. Letters were sent to Paiskim in Eretz Yisrael, Paiskim in Ashkenaz. Letters were sent to marshal support for their positions. Now, and the machlekes raged, and I don't even know what the outcome is. It's not really so important to us who won the fight in 1460. Now, what's interesting though is that one of the main hinging elements of the discussion is Kabbalah, and that's as follows. Reb Michal Balbo, in his chuvas, introducing this whole sugya back and forth, which I'm not sure what the order to do this is really, but let's go in order. There's a sugya hilchati, let's call it. There's a sugya halacha sugya. Had a paskin yibum chalitza. What's kedemus? Yibum kedemus or chalitza kedemus? The Gemara in Yavamis brings a machlekes between Abba Shaul and the Chachamim. Abba Shaul says that we try to stay away from Yibum because in the event that the Yibum is not done l'shem mitzvah mamish b'shlei musa, you're pegeya be'erva v'cheshashani mi mamzeris afilu. Abba Shaul says I'm cheshish it could even be a mamzer. Now this is machlekes rishonim. If Abba Shaul means a mamzer midiraisa, mamzer midirabanan, machlekes the Ritva and the Ramban had to learn it. But there is a day in the Gemara, it's Abba Shaul, that seems to say very clearly that chalitza is kedemus. We don't do Yibum. Yibum was something for tzaddikim for a long time ago. Yibum is not for regular people. And Abba Shaul is talking about regular people in his day. Yibum is not for regular people. But the Chachamim seem to argue in Abba Shaul. The Chachamim seem to say, no, Yibum kedemus. The mitzvah of Yibum is kedemus. That's what the Torah wants from a person to do. If, in the event, a person is not up to it for whatever reason that it is, and he can't do it, or he doesn't want to do it, or she doesn't want it to be done, in that case, the Torah gave you this leeway, this exit strategy called chalitza. But be'etzem is supposed to be Yibum. Now, the problem is that this is something that's in the Gemara is very, very not clear. There's a Mishnah in Daf Nun Zayin, I think it's in Zayin, Yavamis, that says someone who's a Yavam, who's Baal Yavimtoi, Bein Ba'inus, Bein B'ratzin, Bein B'shegig, Bein B'mezid, Bein B'kavana. It's ethical examples of total lack of knowledge and lack of kavana. The Mishnah says it's kaina. That's like the Mishnah. So that Mishnah would seem to imply, not like Abba Shaul on some level. Abba Shaul seems to say you have to have some sort of like kavana, some sort of machshav of what you're doing over here. This Mishnah sounds like just, pashat if you fall off a roof and you're your wife, that's Yibum Mitzchal. And the Rishonim, the Ramban, Bereisham, but others as well point out that the pashtus is this Mishnah is the lav Abba Shaul. Other Rishonim Achalim say no, there's ways to shtim it. There's a Mishnah in Bechiris. The Mishnah in Bechiris, Nafi Gimel Mid Aleph, says as follows. It says chalitza kedemus Yibum. That's what it says. And it leaves it off. It doesn't say. Points out all the Rishonim. L'chayr, this Mishnah is Abba Shaul. I'm sorry, chalitza kedemus Yibum. Chalitza kedemus Yibum. L'chayr, this Mishnah is like Abba Shaul. The chalitza is much more the plan A, and Yibum is only for very big tzaddikim. Yibum is not to be done. It's to be done seldomly. So it's a case where you have machlekes in the Gemara, you have mishnayos, stam mishnayos in different places that associate with each other. Machlekes rishonim, what to take out of these mishnayos? How do we paskin? Lemaisa, most rishonim, by most I mean the Rif, the Rambam in Ziyad and in the Tshuva, and the other Rishonim, Sfardi Rishonim, Paskin, the Yibum Kedemus. Yibum goes first. L'maisa Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam in Tosfos and Yavamis and Daf Lamed Testament Beis are machriya that Chalitza Kedemus. I just want to read a little bit from Tosfos because Tosfos is the one who's most explicit about it. But Tosfos says, Rabbeinu Tam says as follows: Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the halacha kabashol, kistam masisin de bechiris. The halacha is like kabashol, like the stam mission of bechiris, the Chalitzas Kedemus. V'loy ki Rami Bar Chama the Amar Chazru Leim with mitzvahs Yibum Kedemus. Not like Rami Bar Chama who says that in the end they were chayzer and they said the Yibum Kedemus. So what Tosfos is referring to is that there's a Gemara over here in Yavamis and Lamed Test that says B'rishayna Shay Mischavn L'Shay Mitzvah Mitzvahs Yibum Kedemus. Back in the day when people did it L'Shay Mitzvah, Yibum is Kedemus, the Mitzvahs Chalitza. V'achshav Shein Mischavn L'Shay Mitzvah. Now that people are not Mischavn L'Shay Mitzvah, Amru Mitzvahs Chalitza Kedemus, Mitzvahs Yibum. Amru Ram Bar Chama, Amru Yitzchak Chazru Leim Mitzvahs Yibum Kedemus. Ram Bar Chama says no, they came back around. They said Yibum Kedemus again. So he says, Amr Ram Bar Chama, Amr Yitzchak. So he Amr Rav Nachman Yitzchak Achsha Dara. You're telling me that the later Dara is better than the first Dara? Like the first Dara, you were worried about that they weren't tzaddikim enough. Now you're telling me everybody's good. He says, no, Meikara Savar the Kabashal, B'Seif Savar the Karabbanon. So the Gemara itself brings like a machlekes how we hold. So Tosfos says, Rabbeinu Tam says, and this is what his grandfather Rashi held, is that we hold like the Stam Mission and Bechiris, the Chalitzas Kedemus. That's like Tosfos. Other Rishonim Machalik, they see Yibum Kedemus. So you have over here what you could call a very unresolved machlekes. It's an unresolved machlekes in the Gemara. It's unresolved in looking to find rayas from Stamei Mishnah throughout Shas and other places. It's unresolved in the Rishonim. It's unresolved. It's one of these machlekes that don't have a great resolution. And that's important because whenever Kabbalah is going to inject itself into halacha, oftentimes the fertile ground for an injection of Kabbalah is an unresolved halachic issue. An issue where there became a minig one way or the other, but it's unresolved. There's not a klar Gemara. There's not a klar on Hagav Psak. So that's important to note that over here. Now this is the Shaila. Now comes Reb Michal Balbo in his tshuva from 1461, and he writes as follows. He says, this whole machlekes in the Gemara with Tosfos, with Rashi, with Mishnayos and Bechiris, with Gemaras and Yavamis, with Alt, that was all halacha, straight down the line halacha. Today he says we have the Zayar, and the Zayar in Parshas Vayechi and elsewhere is Mayrich, that the idea of Yibum is because of Gilgul. The idea of Yibum is because it's Megalgil, the nefesh of the mace, into his future children. L'hakim l'shem la'achiv means b'derach Gilgul, and it's a much more potent expression of the Gilgul if it comes through his own family, and that's why it has to be a brother, and that's why the oldest brother is Kaidemes, and the Zohar adds many, many layers of Kabbalistic kavanas and Yisaidis to the sugya of Yibum, and the Zohar strongly leans on the side that says Yibum Kaidemes, not Chalitza Kaidemes. So it says in Michal Balbo, okay, you have a nice machlekes in Psak, you have machlekes Rishonim, you have machlekes Mishnayos, based in Ishvasatan, you don't know how to resolve this. Okay, I have how to resolve this. There's a Zayar in a few places. The Zayar says that Yibum Kaidemes, because Yibum is Mishum Gilgul, it's Kabbalistically oriented with the Sugi of Gilgul. So this is what it has to be. Comes Rav Moshe Ashkenazi, guns blazing, and he says, it's a long tshuva. He brings 20 rayas from Chazals, that Chazal didn't believe in Gilgul. This is what he does. He brings 20 rayas, that Gilgul is not, it's something zar, it's not something that's an emunah that we have to believe in, and Memela Hayatachan Tashtal Tzu over here, and this is not Machriya, this is not going to tilt one way or the other over here. This shouldn't be relevant to this machlekes. And no less than 6 tshuvas back and forth between the two of them go on, each one bringing rayas to the kan of the kan. Now, I just want to show you that what Michal Balbo and Ramesh Ashkenazi are arguing about is be'etzem truly one of the biggest progressions in Machshav and Klal Yisrael. Meaning this idea of Gilgul that they're arguing about. The first Hashkafa Sefer ever to be written, probably, I think, someone could correct me if they think it's something else. In Ledaiti, the first Hashkafa Sefer ever to be written is the Rav Sadi Gaon in the Sefer Amunas V'Deis. It's a Sefer written about 1,000 years ago, maybe a little more today. I think that's the first Hashkafa Sefer. Now, in that Sefer, Rav Sadi Gaon, he says as follows: Yesh Hanashim Hanakram Yehudim. There are people who are called Jews. Shemaminim begilgul. The Kairun Oisei Haytakes. I don't know what that word means. There are people who call themselves Jews who believe that the Ruach of Ruvain could transmigrate into Shimon. They think that a man could transmigrate into an animal, and many of these bulbulim. And then he's marach and he's matchet, and he says that this is not a true hashkafa, and this is not what a person has to believe. This is what Rav Sadi Gaon says. Now, everybody knows that Rav Sadi Gaon lived before the Zayar was revealed. Rav Sadi Gaon did not have the Zayar, and many who came after him says, "Ilu ra Rav Sadius divrei Zayar." He wouldn't have said this, meaning he lived in a time when the Zayar wasn't around yet, and if he would have seen the Zayar, he never would have said this. Now, fast forward 500 years later, there's a tshuva from the Maral Bach that I think just shows the full shift. Maral Bach says as follows: here's the shaila. Binyan hashayla hagimel shasha'alta. In mamunas hagilgul davar achreichi laham v'yakol. Is believing in Gilgul something that everyone has to believe in or not? Gam mutter lidish b'barabim. And the second question was, could you darshan about it b'barabim? So he says, da, the Rambam says about himself. This is from the Gedolei HaMeshivim, from the earliest Achronim. He says, I'm not a Mekubal. I'm not zeicha to be familiar with this Kabbalah. You can't tell me just go sit down and learn it because I don't have a Rebbe. This is something you need a Rebbe for. Kabbalah is kishma keinu. It comes from a Rebbe. I'm a Kabbalah from someone who's a Kabbalah from someone, and so on and so forth. There was Manazeh, but there was not so many available Rebbeim to teach me Kabbalah, so I missed out on it. This is what the Rambam writes. He says, in this particular question that you're asking me about, I have perused the various Svarim, and I saw that even in the Chacham who came after the Chassimus Talmud, after the Shas was completed, this is a long-ranging machlokes. If this is a yes a belief or not a belief. He says there was Chacham who were more related to philosophy, Chacham who were related to Kabbalah. These said this, these said those, and they had a machlokes. Amnam yesh kat acheres gedolim oed mechachmei Yisrael hamaminam who believe in it. V'kulam kasvu aleh ki emuna amitis ve'ikar me'ikar atayra l'taretz koshit tzadik v'rali. And they all wrote that this is an important emuna to have me'ikar atayra to be taretz the questions of tzadik v'rali. V'kulanu anachnu, and here's the punchline. V'kulanu anachnu, we, all of us, m'chayavim l'shmaya divrei elu achreinim l'hamen emuna zayis b'lisham pikpik v'safak klal. This is what the Rambam writes 500 years after the Rasag. So the transformation is complete, meaning the Rasag is writing in a time when this was, as the Rambam describes it, an open-ended raging machlekes amongst Chachmei Yisrael. Later on, over the next, preceding 500 years, it became more or less consensus that this is what Klal Yisrael believes. Ha'amram, he says, Lidush b'barabim, that's a whole separate discussion, and there he frowns upon it. It shouldn't be, Kabbalah should be private, it shouldn't be darshan b'barabim. So this is the Rambam, I'm just using this as a capstone to the discussion, meaning the Rasag is the opening salvo, and the Rambam is probably the capstone of the transformation. And in the middle, there's many, many more. Up until, rather, there's a famous Rashash in Baba Kama, B'Metzia, I don't remember, Daf Kuf Zayin, I think. The Rashash has a kasha, the Gemara, is it Ksubit? I can't remember. I don't know. There's a Rashash in the end of one of the Masechtas that has a kasha. The Gemara says, Baruch Ata B'Ve'echa, Baruch Ata B'Tzisacha. The Gemara darshans, Ma B'Yascha Le'elam B'Lechat, Afitzi Yascha Le'elam B'Lechat. Just like you're coming to this world without Avera, so too you're leaving the world without Avera. To which the Rashash says, Mikan Kashik Tzas, Le'amunas HaGilgul, because Ma B'Yascha Le'elam B'Lechat. If everybody's coming with a peckle, with a package, or something that has to be resolved, or something that needs to be dealt with, how can B'Yascha Le'elam B'Lechat? This is the Rashash. And the Satmar Rebbe, the Yoel in Svarim, a few places brings a teretz to this kasha. This is the Rashash's famous ha'ara, much later after the thing was settled, and whatever, Ayin Sham. But the point is, so this machlekes that's going on in Chachmei Yisrael becomes a central theme in this discussion about Yibum. Ramachal Balbo says, Kabbalah says that Yibum is Mishum Gilgul, Yibum Kedemes, and we should encourage Yibum. And Ramesh Ashkenazi says, no, Kabbalah is fine, I believe it, it's nice, it's great, but it doesn't impact the halacha. There's no reason the halacha should change because of a Kabbalistic machshava that you thought of. This Gilgul thing is he shows him all the shittas and all the rayas that it's not. And Meli says, I'm not meshubat to this. And this machlekes goes on and on. They write letters to Ashkenaz, where Rav Moshe Ashkenazi gets strong support for his position. But the letters come back and say nothing to do with Gilgul particularly, but the letter that he gets from two different poskim that tell him that you're right, Kabbalah should not be getting mixed into the halacha. You're right, halacha is halacha, Kabbalah is Kabbalah, and you should not allow a Kabbalistic idea to get mixed in and change the halacha. Not so much writing about, polemicizing pro or against Gilgul, that's not their discussion. Their discussion is just that, this is, and the Minig Ashkenaz of Rashi and Tam should stand, that's the halacha, and don't allow Kabbalah to be mixed in. The letter that he receives from Eretz Yisrael also is not so much focused on allowing, on pro-Gilgul and anti-Gilgul, it just says, and Sholdik, I don't know why you're so convinced that the halacha is like you. The halacha is not even like you. Bayuns and all of the Sephardic Messiah and all the Rishonim with Sephardi Poskim all say that the halacha is to Yibum. So I don't know what you're getting all worked up about. This is the halacha. The halacha is like Michal. He's right. The halacha should be Yibum. So this is like a proto case of Kabbalah. This is before Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is not written yet. Now this is like a proto case of the impact of halacha and Kabbalah and in Kabbalah and halacha. Now why does this play such a big role? Is because the Beis Yosef was the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch. He had a Rebbe. His Rebbe's name was Yitzchak Cairo, his uncle. The Beis Yosef quotes him a handful of places throughout the Pirish Beis Yosef. Now in Chuvas Beis Yosef, from the Beis Yosef, in the Chelik that deals with Even Ezer and Yanim, the Beis Yosef brings in the end the tshuva from his uncle, Tshuva Servitz L'Kairo. It's at the end of the Sefer. It's a long tshuva. And it's a tshuva about what would you have it? The same shaila. The Yibum Kedemas Hachalitza Kedemas. And the Beis Yosef's uncle and his Rebbe makes a big push that Hayos, the Zayar, so strongly favors Yibum Kedemas, Yibum should be Kedemas. And that should be the halacha. The Beis, no less than the Beis Yosef's own Rebbe, Ritzla Cairo, makes a big push and infuses in exactly this case and says, he has a few other examples, and they all make it to the Beis Yosef's Pirush more or less, Tefillin and Chalamayid, Tefillin of Bin Tam, this case, and whatever, a few more examples, but where he says that yes, if we have enough in a Zayar that's coming to resolve an open-ended debate, a debate that's going on in halacha that isn't settled, certainly the Kabbalah should play a role and should be the deciding factor. And he goes through his first, he has, 7 or 8 rayas to this, but his first 2 rayas that the halacha should be Yibum Kedemes is purely from the Kabbalah. That's what Ritzla Cairo says. Now the Beis Yosef quotes from this tshuva liberally in a few different places, and the Beis Yosef himself, it seems to be, people are going to argue with me on this, it seems to be the Beis Yosef's posture more or less is that it is acceptable to include Kabbalistic things into the halacha. The Ramah in Hilchas Yibum, where this pops up in Hilchas Yibum, the Ramah, Afanart, strongly encourages chalitza. He doesn't say Yibum won't work or won't be chal or it's aser, but he strongly pushes it in Kuf Samachay in Even Ezer all the way in the end in Hilchas Yibum. The Mechaber says Yibum Kedemes, and the Ramah says the Mechaber is a little tricky. Let's assume the Mechaber says Yibum Kedemes, and the Ramah, let's assume, says Chalitza Kedemes. It seems to be that's the Machlekes the Ramah and the Mechaber, which is probably why it would be a fair thing to say that overall the Messiah became that the Sfardim are more accepting of allowing Kabbalistic things into the halacha, and Ashkenazim were much more reticent into allowing Kabbalistic things into halacha. Now I say that in a very power of way because there's tons of exceptions in both directions. There are plenty of things that are Kabbalistic that Gedolei Poiskei Sfardim were strongly misnaged to, and there are plenty of things that are Kabbalistic things that the Gedolei Poiskei Ashkenaz welcomed with open arms. So it's far from a complete science, but it's a good building block of how. Now there's rather one part of this tshuva, Sam, that I want to read to you because I got a kick out of this. I think this is a great tzach. The whole discussion of Chalitza Kedemas, Yibum Kedemas from a halacha perspective hinges on if people are mean the right things or not, right? What are their machshavas? Are people doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? So here the Ritzla Cairo writes as follows. He says, V'rayel is a shein hefresh ben deris rishonim la'achronim l'shenayim she'deris rishonim v'adei mecham l'shem mitzvah deris rishonim v'adei mecham l'shem mitzvah. He says the premise of this is that deris rishonim were all good guys. They mamash all had in mind to do kavanas mitzvah, and we Nebuch, we're bad people. We all want to do it's all l'shem avera. He says hu she'enim mevin. Only someone who doesn't know what was going on in Deris Rishonim could say that. Shegam kein Deris Rishonim ani roya evdei v'dizara megali arayis shev chidamim kol yimei hasheftim v'malachim rubim deminker. If not always, then almost always, and if not by everyone, then by most is megali evdei v'dizara megali arayis shev chidamim. Which katzva neviim Rishonim v'achronim, like the neviim Rishonim v'achronim are replete with examples of this. V'ayitzit katzam shalelu v'rishasim shalelu. There were tzaddikim and there was rishaim. There's not such a big difference, he's writing 500 years ago, between us and them. They had nisyonis and people who were nichshel and good people and people who were oimid on various levels in the nisyonis, and we have the same. And if I'm able to, I venture to say we probably could say it's much the same. Just that part of this tshuva was like a very interesting bit. Like he says, I don't know what you're saying. Like we have to presume that everyone else was a tzaddik always, and we're the only rishayim. There was always struggle. There was always challenge. Now. I don't know even where, there's way too much to discuss over here, and I don't know how long I'm talking for. But okay, we'll go a little bit weiter. So this is a basic, I guess, let's call it like a building block, an overview of how some of these machleksim will find their way in. Now, Lamaisa, in the Shulchan Aruch, there's tens already of examples, and if you include, all the Magen Avrams and the Arizals and etc. that get added in, there's probably hundreds of examples of Kabbalistic things, and to one degree or another, people hold to them or don't hold to them, include them, don't include them. Now, I think let's talk about the Gaon a little bit, because the Gaon is another one of these very muddled up positions when it comes to Kabbalah and Halacha. It's unclear. The Gaon, mitzad echad, argues on the Arizal when he's introduced into Halacha many times, probably 10 to 15 times, that the Arizal is brought by the Poskim, let's say by a Magen Avram or something, or a Shla or whatever, to influence the Psak, and the Gaon will argue on it. So the Gaon, seemingly mitzad echad, seems to be pushing out, Kabbalistic influences into the Shulchan Aruch. Mitzad sheni, the Gaon brings oftentimes in the Bir Agra many times sources from a Zayar. Like a din that we're struggling to find out why the din is so, the Gaon will bring a Zayar that's the makar for the din. So the Gaon mitzad echad seems to bring it, mitzad sheni doesn't seem to bring it. So now, The first shlav of understanding it is l'chayr Rav Chaim Volozhiner in the Akdama T'Safra Tznusa that we read last week. Rav Chaim Volozhiner over there seems to be threading the needle and saying that the Goyin, one of the big accusations that the Chassidim had against the Goyin, the Baal Tanya even in his letter about Chassidus writes this, that the Goyin was mezalzel in the Arizal. The Goyin didn't hold with the Arizal. Now Rav Chaim Volozhiner in the Akdama T'Safra Tznusa is coming to address that, and he says, of course the Goyin held of the Arizal very stark, but the Goyin didn't believe that everything that we have from the Arizal is from the Arizal. The Goyin felt that some things were not exact from the Arizal. The Goyin felt that the Arizal had a particular, call it derech halimud in Kabbalah, and the Goyin himself had a slightly different derech halimud in Kabbalah, and the Goyin was okay having a machlokes him and the Arizal. Not that he disputed, he just didn't think, he didn't believe that everything came from Eliyahu Hanavi and that he wasn't able to be chaylik on it. The Goyin said, Miktsasai came from a Gilei of Eliyahu Hanavi, Veruba deruba came mi chachmasei amuflages, from the Arizal's chachma amuflages. And everybody, it's no different than any other machlokes achreinim. Just like the Goyin could argue on a Taz or a Magen Avram or a Bach or even a Ramah. So the Goyin said I could argue on an Arizal too, meaning it's not only things that are Giluyim and Shemayim I can't argue, and things that are not Giluyim and Shemayim I could argue from. So the simplest resolution is l'chayr that the Goyin felt that there were a lot of things that were not Makori. The Goyin felt certain things that come from the Zohar that he was able to ascertain that really come from the Zohar. The Goyin was kaifef reisha and said that deserves to be implied into halacha in some circumstances, and he would bring those in. But things that are just from different Mekubalim, even being from the Arizal, if the Goyin felt that he learned the Zohar, the source material differently, he had no problem arguing in it and digging zich on it. That seems to be the shlav one of the Goyin's of the confusion as to what the Goyin allowed and what the Goyin didn't allow. Additionally, the Goyin, at least it seems to be the Simseir quoted by some Talmidim, it seems the Goyin held, or the Goyin said upon him, he said in particular to one machlokes from a Gemara Brachas with the Zohar directly, but the Goyin seemed to say that l'daiter there is no machlokes in between Kabbalah and Halacha. It's just a lack of understanding. Meaning, everything at its core is one, and if someone has the Aimek Halimud and the Yeshiva Das and the Hasmada to get down to the bottom of everything, he could possibly figure out how nothing's a machlokes, and the Goyin may presumably have held that he, on a lot of inyanim, tracked it down to its core thing and was able to isolate why it's not a machlokes. And if it appears to be a machlokes, it's either because you're learning the Zohar wrong or the Gemara wrong. Meaning you're learning one of them wrong if it appears to be a machlokes. There's even Yeshayim that the Goyin had intention, plans to write a Shulchan Aruch that was going to be a Shulchan Aruch that was going to comprise everything, meaning to blend all the Zohar with all the Gemara, all the Kabbalah and Halacha in one, and show how everything is really one, but Leis Dayim Milsid, like he wasn't able to do it. So there's another layer to the Goyin's thing. So what it does for us is it makes it confusing, and it means that there's no real rule to it, because we can't actually understand how this is or isn't the machlokes. And Yaakov Hillel has tshuva sometimes 20, 30 pages long about Goyin versus Arizal and how to learn a Zohar. Like I mean, so like what it leaves us is that there is no real, hard and set rule. Now the Mishnah Berurah in Simul Chafei brings a Knesset Agdela, and I guess I'll end with this because there is no real set rule. But the Mishnah Berurah seems to say as follows: that anytime there's a machlokes Kabbalah and Halacha, meaning often a machlokes the Gemara says one way, Zohar says another way, Halacha is ki Gemara. Poskim versus the Zohar, Halacha ki Gemara. That's what he says. Now, what about if the Zohar is just a Chumrah, meaning it's not arguing, just being Ma'aseh Chumrah? In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah b'Shem the Knesset Agdela, you could be machmer. Let's say something is not brought in Gemara at all; it's only brought from the Zohar, only brought from the Kabbalah. Mishnah Berurah says, again, quoting Knesset Agdela, who's really quoting a Radvaz and a Re'im, that we can't be kaifef people to do it. You can't force people to do an haga that's only based in Kabbalah. But if someone wants to, they could do it. Now, the trickiest part, and where most of the gray area is, and I don't know, either we'll leave this for another time or we'll just leave it as gray area, is when there's a long-running machlokes hapaiskim, or machlokes and sugis, like the case of Ibum. That is the trickiest part. The grayest area is when there is a lot said on it in the Gemara and there is a lot said on it in the paiskim, but there is no clear resolution. It's something that's open. In that case, that's where this gray area is, where you'll find oftentimes Kabbalah introduced with some hisnagdus, meaning you'll find more Svardim, and then in turn some Hasidim, like Kamarna Zidichoiv, Minkach, some Hasidim who are more comfortable introducing Kabbalah would strongly favor introducing Kabbalah in those cases. And then you'll find like normal, Psak Ashkenaz, the Aruch HaShulchan, Mishnah Berurah, etc., going much more angling towards halacha. That's the gray area cases, and there's I want to say hundreds of examples of where there could be discussion points of that, and I think we'll leave it at this.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.